it felt like inspiration had abandoned me. After the success of my second-to-last book, I had poured all my hopes into the latest one, determined to make it even better. But it flopped. Critics were indifferent, sales dragged, and the whole thing bruised my ego. And my confidence even more. I realized I was burned out. I needed to break away from the grind, escape the urban chaos, and give my mind some rest. I wasn't married, had no family to keep me grounded, so there was nothing holding me back. I stumbled upon the town in West Virginia by pure chance. One night, sitting in a bar trying to drown my disappointment in cheap whiskey, I came across a battered old brochure. The cover featured snapshots of green hills, a pond reflecting the glow of a setting sun, and a wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Elderwood." The name lodged itself in my mind, refusing to let go. I started digging for more information and discovered it was a tiny place, population barely 2,000. Nestled deep in the woods, the town mostly survived on logging, farming, or scraping by on a trickle of underdeveloped tourism. I didn't think twice. Homes there were dirt cheap, especially compared to what I was used to seeing in the city. I bought a small house on the very edge of town, right at the border of the forest. It was old but sturdy, with weathered wooden walls painted a faded blue, a sagging porch, and an attic window that stared straight into the woods. The house seemed to whisper to me, "Here you'll find what you're looking for." The move was a hassle, but I managed. I rented a truck and stuffed it with my modest belongings, a few boxes of books, my old typewriter, a sagging couch, and a wooden desk where I'd written my novels. It all felt so important while I was packing, but the moment I stepped into that house, I realized most of it was just clutter. On my first day, as I unloaded boxes, a neighbor came over. He was a Native American man in his 60s, tall, with sun-worn skin etched by fine wrinkles. His long, silver-streaked hair was tied in a thin braid, and a simple silver earring dangled from his ear. He introduced himself. "Call me Will River. I live across the way. If you need anything, just let me know." His voice was deep and calm, the kind that suggested this man never rushed for anyone or anything. We chatted for a bit. He told me about the town, mentioning that he used to work as a guide for tourists back when people still came. These days, he ran a small workshop, carving wooden animals and making things for the locals. I immediately liked Will. There was something about his voice, a calm confidence that made it feel like he understood something about the world that I never would. We talked for a while, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was like a walking story, just waiting to be told. The next day, once the boxes were unpacked and the house started feeling a bit more like home, I decided to take a walk around the town. I wanted to meet the locals, see how they lived, and soak in the atmosphere. The people of Elderwood were welcoming, almost too welcoming, like they were grateful for anyone new to break up the monotony of their quiet lives. As I wandered along the main street, I found myself drawn to a small gift shop. A peeling sign above the door crookedly declared, "Gifts and other knickknacks." The large windows were cluttered with wooden figurines, glass globes containing miniature forests, and carved signs with sayings like, "Welcome," and "Happiness lives here." The door jingled loudly with an old-fashioned bell as I stepped inside. The shop was cramped but cozy. The shelves were so tightly packed that I had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The air smelled of pine resin and something sweetly vanilla, probably from the candles arranged on a nearby stand. Behind the counter stood a woman, a plump figure with a kind, round face and sharp, observant eyes. A name tag on her sweater read Betty. "Welcome," she greeted me with a bright, enthusiastic smile. Her voice was cheerful with the practiced warmth of someone used to chatting with customers all day. "Thanks," I replied, glancing around the shelves. "It's atmospheric in here." "Atmospheric?" She laughed. A light, musical sound, though her eyes hinted at mild surprise. "Not a word I hear often, but I'll take it. You're not from around here, are you?" "Just moved in yesterday," I said. "Thought I'd explore the town, get to know the place." "Well, you've come to the right spot." Betty straightened her sweater slightly, like she'd just realized she was the unofficial ambassador of Elderwood. "Everything here's local, from the farm goods to the souvenirs. And don't leave without trying our syrup. It's the best in the region." We started chatting. Betty was remarkably open, and her enthusiasm was contagious. She told me her family had owned the shop for 3 generations. Tourism in the town had dwindled, she admitted, but they still got the occasional visitor. Most sales now happened online, though she seemed proud of keeping the physical shop running despite tough times. As we talked, her phone buzzed on the counter. Betty excused herself and answered. "Yes?" she said, her tone suddenly cautious. "What? When?" She fell silent, listening, but I noticed her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her sweater. "I see. Thanks for letting me know." She hung up and stared past me, her gaze distant, as if trying to process what she'd just heard. "Is everything okay?" I asked carefully. "Bill's missing," she said, almost as if she didn't believe it herself. "Who's Bill?" I prompted, giving her a moment to gather herself. "Bill Martin, one of our loggers," she said quietly. "He went into the woods yesterday and never came back. His wife just called. He's still not home." I nodded, trying not to show how intrigued I was. A disappearance in a place like this, where everyone knew everyone, always carried an ominous weight. "Does that happen often around here?" I asked. She shook her head, still looking unsettled. "The last time something like this happened was over 20 years ago," she said. "People went missing back then too. But that was a long time ago. We thought it was all behind us." "And did they find them?" I pressed. She hesitated. "Only one," she finally said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "They found him in the woods, but he'd been torn apart by wolves, or something else." Her words hung in the air, leaving an unpleasant chill. I wanted to ask more, but just then, the bell over the door jingled sharply. Will stepped into the shop, carrying a large cardboard box. His gaze immediately went to Betty, his expression calm but piercing, as if he could sense the tension in the room. "Trouble?" he asked, his voice steady and deep. Betty let out a heavy sigh, leaning against the counter. Her face was clouded with worry as she looked at Will as if hoping he might offer some reassurance. "Bill went into the woods yesterday," she said, struggling to find the right words. "In the morning. His wife said he always comes home by dinner, but this time, he didn't even take his phone." Will frowned, his expression darkening. Without a word, he set the box he was carrying onto the counter and began unpacking it, one carved figure at a time. The first was a wooden bear, rough yet crafted with an unmistakable care, as if Will had put a part of himself into it. Next came deer, owls, and even a few human figurines. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, like a man used to giving every task his full attention. "And now what?" he finally asked, not looking up. "They're searching for him," Betty replied. "I heard the sheriff got a group of volunteers together. But you know, Will, if he got lost in the woods..." She trailed off, and Will gave a slight nod, as if he knew exactly what she meant. After a pause, he began placing the carvings back into the box. "Tough times," he muttered under his breath. Though he spoke quietly, I caught his words. They lingered in the air, carrying the weight of an old, unspoken sorrow. As Will prepared to leave, Betty gestured toward a stack of boxes in the corner. "Wait, you promised to take those too," she said. "You're kidding, right?" he replied, eyeing the 6 hefty boxes skeptically. Judging by the way they were stacked, each looked like it weighed a good deal. Before he could refuse, I stepped in. "I'll help," I offered, grabbing one of the boxes. "I've got the time." Will simply nodded, but I caught a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. Together we carried the boxes out of the shop and headed toward his house. Outside, the sun was dipping lower in the sky, and the air was rich with the earthy scent of damp leaves. "You mentioned tough times," I said as we walked, hoping to coax a story from him without being too pushy. "Did it have to do with the disappearances?" Will hesitated as if weighing whether to answer. Finally, he spoke. "Yeah," he said. "About 20 years ago, a few folks went into the woods and never came back. People searched for them for weeks but only found one. The rest, it was like they'd vanished into thin air." "And the one they found?" I asked, pressing gently. Will nodded slowly, as if he'd expected the question. "Wolves," he said flatly. "Or something worse. Nobody ever figured it out." We arrived at his house, which stood next to mine. It was a small, weathered place with darkened wood that had borne the weight of countless seasons. The porch sagged slightly, its boards creaking under even the lightest step. But Will didn't take me inside. Instead, he led me around the side toward a workshop that stood a little apart from the house near the edge of the woods. It was a low building painted in a muted greenish gray, with large windows that revealed shelves and tools inside. "Don't worry, it's safe here," he said, pushing open the workshop door. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of fresh-cut wood, varnish, and a faint trace of tobacco. The floor was scattered with wood shavings, and the walls were lined with tools: axes, planes, chisels, and saws. In the corner stood a heavy workbench covered in unfinished carvings. One of them, roughly shaped, seemed to resemble a wolf, though the details were too crude to tell for sure. Nearby, a shelf displayed finished works. A small army of wooden animals and human figures, each carved with an incredible attention to detail. At the center of the workshop, standing directly in front of the workbench, was the most impressive thing in the room: a towering section of a massive totem pole. It was magnificent, as though it had been crafted not just with hands, but with the soul of the carver. The base depicted a colossal bear standing upright on its hind legs, its mouth open in a silent roar that seemed almost audible. Above it perched an owl, wings outstretched, its eyes so intricately carved they felt alive. And at the very top was a wolf, frozen mid-leap, as if it were ready to spring forward at any moment. I stepped closer, unable to tear my eyes away. Every detail of the totem was carved with astonishing precision. Ancient symbols were etched into the wood with meticulous care, their meaning a mystery to me. I ran my hand along the cool surface, feeling the rough texture of the carvings beneath my fingers. "This is incredible," I said, turning to Will. "Where are you going to put it?" He looked up at me, his gaze lingering as though he were deciding how much to tell. Finally, in a low voice, he said, "In the forest. There's a place my ancestors used. It's a burial ground. The totem will stand there to protect their rest." He turned away and busied himself stacking boxes in the corner. His movements were quick and abrupt, a stark contrast to his earlier calm. His eyes darted to the workshop doors more than once, as if expecting someone to burst in with bad news. It was clear Bill's disappearance weighed heavily on him. Sensing his unease, I decided not to linger and headed back to my own house. That evening, I sat at my desk, trying to write. But my thoughts kept circling back to the oddities of the town, Bill's disappearance, and the totem pole in Will's workshop. The uneasy energy of Elderwood had seeped into me, making it impossible to concentrate. The next day, as I went out for a walk, I noticed the town had changed. There was a palpable tension in the air. People moved quicker than usual, their faces grim. When I reached the square, I saw a small crowd gathering. Groups of people stood clustered together, speaking in low, urgent tones. At the center of it all was a man in a sheriff's hat and uniform, his voice firm as he gave orders, assigning people into search parties. I approached cautiously. The sheriff noticed me immediately, his expression hardening as he pointed in my direction. "And who's this?" he asked sharply. "He's the new guy," one of the men standing nearby answered. "Just moved in." The sheriff gave me a once-over, then shook his head. "We've got a serious situation here," he said. "We're heading into the woods, and only those with weapons should come." "I've got a rifle," I offered, keeping my tone even. The sheriff gave a curt nod, not asking any more questions. I glanced around at the group I'd been assigned to. 2 men stood with me. The first was in his 60s, with a thick beard and a weathered face. His sharp eyes darted around, assessing everything. He wore a faded camouflage jacket that had clearly seen better days. "Tom Hart," he said, extending a firm hand. Next to him was a younger man, probably in his mid-20s. He was tall and lean, with an easy smile that hinted at mischief, though his eyes carried a steely resolve. "Mike," he said, introducing himself. Once the groups were finalized, the sheriff gave a quick rundown of the plan. Each team was given machetes or shears for clearing brush. Group leaders received small radios for communication. He made it clear that caution was paramount. "We appreciate your help," he said, addressing the crowd. "The authorities have sent some people, but it's not enough. Every pair of eyes out there counts." As the crowd began to disperse, I told my group to wait while I headed home to grab my rifle. Years ago, I'd taken up hunting as a hobby and bought a rifle, never expecting it to serve any real purpose. Now, it seemed like fate had finally called its number. When I returned with the rifle slung over my shoulder, Tom gave a small nod of approval. Mike, noticing the weapon, grinned. We climbed into Tom's old but sturdy SUV, the kind of vehicle that had clearly seen its share of dusty backroads. The seat smelled faintly of worn leather and sawdust, and a battered map of the area was crumpled in the glove compartment. When Tom turned the key, the engine rumbled to life, a low growl like a bear waking from hibernation. We pulled onto a narrow, overgrown road that wound its way deeper into the woods, the branches overhead forming a jagged canopy. "Been working at the sawmill for 40 years now," Tom said abruptly, breaking the silence. "Know these woods like the back of my hand." "I'm a plumber," Mike chimed in from the back seat. "Not much call for plumbing out here, though. Gives me a good excuse to head into the woods a couple of times a month just to get some air, you know." Tom grunted in acknowledgement but didn't reply. Their small talk filled the cab, easing the tension just a little as the forest seemed to close in around us. Finally, we reached a clearing. The dense trees parted to reveal a small open space covered with soft grass and a scattering of yellow wildflowers. In the center stood the crumbling remains of some old stone structure. Maybe it was once a well, or a tiny building long reclaimed by nature. Tall ferns encircled the area, and the distant call of a bird pierced the eerie stillness. "We'll start here," Tom announced as he climbed out of the vehicle. He surveyed the clearing like a man who had learned to size up a situation with precision. Mike and I followed his lead. For the first few hours, we moved in a line, combing through the woods, checking behind trees, undergrowth, and even beneath old, gnarled roots. But there was no sign of Bill, or anything unusual for that matter. Time dragged on, the shadows lengthened, and eventually the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into twilight. "It's getting late," Tom muttered, glancing up at the dimming sky. "We should head back." We started making our way toward the car when Mike suddenly froze and raised his hand. "You see that?" he whispered, pointing deeper into the forest. I squinted, and there it was, a dark shadow flickering between the trees. It moved quickly, almost silently, and seemed to be watching us. "Who's there?" Mike shouted, shining his flashlight in the direction of the movement. The beam danced across the trees, illuminating bark, branches, and shifting shadows, but there was nothing there. Tom and I both readied our weapons, his trusty old shotgun and my rifle. My hands were steady, but my breathing wasn't. The silence pressed down on us, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then the shadow moved again, closer this time. It wasn't shaped like a person, too low to the ground and oddly elongated. Whatever it was, it moved with a speed that didn't seem natural. "Hey!" Mike called out again, but the shadow darted away, disappearing deeper into the woods. We stood frozen for a moment, adrenaline coursing through our veins. "Let's go," Tom said quietly, his voice steady but edged with unease. Without another word, we turned back toward the car, our eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Whatever that thing was, it had shaken all of us. On the drive back, Tom spoke again, his voice lower now, as though he were dredging up a memory he'd rather forget. "There's always been something strange about these woods," he said, "especially on the far side. There's an old Native American burial ground over there." "A burial ground?" I asked, curiosity flaring despite the lingering unease. "Yeah," Tom replied. "Since the town was founded, people have been warned to stay away. It's sacred ground. Only Will's allowed to go near it. His ancestors are buried there." "What happens if someone ignores the warning?" I pressed. "People say those who trespass either disappear or come back. Different," Tom said, keeping his eyes on the road. "Of course, that's just talk, but I wouldn't risk it." I fell silent, mulling over his words. Whatever was out there, the story of the burial ground and Will added an unsettling layer to the already eerie night. By the time we pulled up to my house, I couldn't shake the image of that shadow moving through the trees. It left behind a chill that sank deep into my bones, a cold fear I couldn't quite explain. Days passed, but the search for Bill yielded nothing. The town carried on with its routine, but unease crept into people's faces, flickering in their eyes like shadows. I, never one to sit idle, spent my time scribbling notes for the book I'd been planning to write. Sometimes I'd wander the woods alone, always with my rifle slung over my shoulder. Those walks felt oddly calming, almost meditative, yet the gnawing anxiety in the pit of my stomach never truly left. A couple of times I stopped by Will's place, hoping to ask him about the burial ground, the totem, and his take on everything that had been happening. But each time, his house was empty, and no one seemed to know where he'd gone. His absence only deepened the mystery, a question left dangling in my mind. Then, a week after the search began, the thing everyone feared most happened. A second person disappeared. This time it was a woman named Martha, who had gone into the woods to pick berries and never returned. The town, which had been simmering with quiet dread, boiled over. Whispers about past disappearances 20 years ago spread like wildfire. The town square filled with people ready to form search parties. Their urgency reignited. When I saw the gathering, I knew I couldn't stay on the sidelines. Something about these events pulled me in, as if an invisible thread was drawing me toward the woods again. I spotted Tom and Mike standing by a truck, waving me over. With them was a woman, maybe in her mid-30s, her russet hair braided neatly down her back. She wore a faded jumpsuit and carried herself with a quiet intensity. "This is Carol," Tom said, introducing her as I approached. "She works with me at the mill. Martha was her neighbor." Carol nodded curtly, her expression set in a grim mask. We grouped up, 4 of us this time, which offered some sense of security, though the looming forest still felt unnervingly oppressive. Our team was assigned a different section of the woods this time, northwest of town, deeper in. The trees grew denser here, the trails long since reclaimed by grass and underbrush. The air felt damper, colder, as though the forest itself wanted to push us away. The going was tough. Branches snagged our clothes and the ground became uneven, forcing us to move cautiously. We combed the area methodically, our eyes scanning every shadow, every patch of earth, but the hours ticked by without a single lead. By the time dusk began to settle, Tom called it. "It's getting dark," he said, looking at the sky, where the sun had all but disappeared behind the horizon. "No point staying out here at night." We started back, picking our way through the thick undergrowth, when a sharp, piercing scream shattered the silence. It was a woman's voice, filled with raw terror. "Damn it," Mike cursed, fumbling for his flashlight. "It came from over there." He pointed to the right, his hand trembling slightly. We charged toward the sound, crashing through the trees, but when we got there, no one was in sight. The leaves still quivered on the branches, as if disturbed only moments ago. We stopped, ears straining against the silence that had fallen over the woods once more. And then the scream came again, this time from a different direction. It was the same voice, pleading, desperate. "Someone's messing with us," Carol muttered under her breath, her fists clenching tightly. We exchanged uneasy glances. The whole situation felt wrong, horribly, chillingly wrong. The cries seemed to come from different spots, almost simultaneously. It wasn't possible, unless whatever it was wanted us to follow. "What do we do?" Mike asked, his voice shaky but determined. Tom glanced at each of us, then made the call. "We split up. Carol and I will head south. You two go north. If you find anything or hear anything, fire a shot. It'll be the signal." "Got it," I said, checking my rifle. Mike and I turned northward, pushing deeper into the trees. The forest grew darker, the canopy overhead thickening until the last traces of light were swallowed up. The trail vanished entirely, forcing us to hack through bushes and low branches as we pressed on. The screams didn't come again, but the silence was worse. It was heavy, unnatural, as if the entire forest had paused to watch us. "Do you think it could be a person?" Mike asked, his voice unsteady despite his best efforts to sound calm. "I don't know," I admitted, the weight of the rifle reassuring in my hands. We plunged deeper into the woods, following the fractured echoes of the scream that grew fainter and more distant with every step. Sometimes it would abruptly stop, only to start again, as if it were deliberately luring us. But each time, the voice seemed to come from a different direction, making it impossible to tell where to go. Finally, my patience snapped, and I muttered under my breath, "Someone's playing games with us, or it's a trap." Mike glanced at me, but he didn't say a word. In the faint beam of his flashlight, his face looked pale, his eyes gleaming with tension. We pressed on, though every instinct screamed at me that this was a mistake. The forest around us grew darker, the moon barely piercing the thick canopy above. Mike's flashlight illuminated only fragments of the path, now more like a labyrinth of trees and tangled underbrush. The branches reached toward us like gnarled fingers, and the silence was so heavy it felt like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Then behind us came a noise, a loud, cracking rustle as something large barreled through the bushes. We both froze. My grip tightened on the rifle, and Mike, breathing heavily, swung his flashlight toward the sound. "Who's there?" he shouted, but no answer came. The rustling came again, this time from the opposite direction. We spun around, weapons at the ready. The forest seemed alive, as if it were watching us, its shadows hiding something that refused to reveal itself. "We need to head back," I said finally, my voice low and urgent. But just as we took a step to retreat, something burst out of the bushes with a crash. It moved too fast to make out clearly. The flashlight caught only glimpses, unnaturally long limbs, a glint of something slick, fur maybe, or skin. It moved in a jerky, disjointed way, as though its body was out of sync with itself, leaving behind an impression of fractured motion. Both of us fired at the same time. The gunshots shattered the silence, the recoil slamming into my shoulder, but the creature didn't stop. It lunged forward, and before I could react, something slammed into me, knocking me off my feet. I hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs in a ragged gasp. I heard Mike scream, his voice high and shaking with panic. "No, God, no!" There was the sound of scrambling footsteps, more shouting, another gunshot. It all happened so fast, I couldn't make sense of it. By the time I staggered back to my feet, gripping my rifle tightly, the forest had fallen silent again. I spun around, searching frantically. "Mike!" I yelled, but only the echo of my voice answered. He was gone. The shadow that had attacked us had vanished. Only the broken branches and trampled grass bore any evidence that something had happened here. My heart pounded so violently it felt like it might burst from my chest. I made the decision to retreat. The forest now felt hostile, almost sentient, its presence pressing down on me like an oppressive weight. But as I tried to navigate my way back, I realized with a sinking feeling that I was lost. Every turn looked the same, the flashlight picking out nothing but identical trees and undergrowth. "Mike!" I shouted again, desperation creeping into my voice, but the woods remained implacably silent. I kept moving, though my legs wavered with exhaustion. The darkness grew heavier, as if the night itself was thickening around me. Then my light caught something, a mark carved into the bark of a tree. It was a strange symbol, spiraling into an arrow. A few steps further, I found another, and another. The symbols formed a trail, leading me somewhere. I followed them, my pulse hammering in my ears. Finally, the forest opened up into a clearing, and I stopped, breathless. What lay before me stole the air from my lungs. It was a graveyard. The place felt sacred, alien, and captivating all at once. At the center stood a towering totem carved from the trunk of an enormous tree. At its apex perched a massive owl, wings spread wide as if ready to take flight. Below the owl was a wolf, its teeth bared, and beneath that, a bear, its bulk carved with imposing precision. Their eyes, etched with eerie detail, seemed alive, staring directly at me. Around the totem were smaller figures, each depicting animals, deer, snakes, lynxes, and others that I couldn't identify. Their shapes were distorted, elongated, almost as if they were caught in mid-movement, despite their stillness. Stone altars dotted the clearing, adorned with feathers, bones, and bundles of dried herbs tied with leather strips. The place was both unsettling and mesmerizing. Fear coiled in my gut, but it was mingled with an almost overwhelming curiosity. It felt as though I had stepped into a realm where time didn't exist, where the ordinary rules of the world held no power. Whatever was happening here, it was beyond anything I could explain. Mesmerized by the strange clearing, I didn't realize I'd taken a few hesitant steps forward, drawn deeper into the eerie space. My eyes darted from the carved figures to the towering totems and the symbols etched into the bark of surrounding trees. Then, something caught my attention, something that stood apart from the rest. It was a stone structure rising in the center of the clearing, just off to the side of the totems. At first glance, it looked like an ancient well. The stones were dark, mottled with moss and cracks, as if time itself had tried to devour them. But the top of the well was sealed with a massive stone slab, its surface far less weathered, almost as if it had been placed there recently. The slab was slightly askew, leaving a narrow gap that exuded an ominous air of secrecy. Cautiously, I moved closer, scanning the ground around it. The earth was packed firm, as though many feet had trampled over it. I noticed boot prints, large ones like those of workers, then smaller impressions as if someone had walked barefoot. But what chilled me to my core were the other tracks. They weren't human. They were large, clawed, and eerily distinct, with elongated digits that suggested something monstrous. A shiver ran down my spine, but my curiosity pushed me onward. I approached the well, leaning over to peer through the narrow slit. Inside, there was nothing but darkness. Dense, impenetrable, as though it swallowed any light that tried to pierce it. Then I heard it. A sound, faint at first, rising steadily. It was a combination of noises, wet, squelching movements, faint scraping, and a peculiar metallic ring, like claws dragging across stone. My breath hitched, and I tightened my grip on the flashlight, angling it toward the gap. The beam sliced into the abyss, illuminating something that made my blood run cold. Shapes moved along the inner walls of the well. Their outlines were bizarre, elongated, twisting, crawling with an unnatural fluidity. Their movements were sharp and jarring, as if they distorted the very space around them. Whenever the light touched them, they recoiled into the shadows, vanishing from sight. But they were there. This wasn't some trick of the light. My pulse hammered in my ears, my breath shallow and fast. The air seemed heavier, suffocating. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the ground. And then, from somewhere deep in the woods, came a sound. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, and the sound grew closer with each passing second. I froze, my entire body locked in terror. The steps were uneven, deliberate but wrong, as though whoever or whatever was approaching wasn't used to walking on two legs. My chest tightened, every instinct screaming at me to flee. Run! The thought hit like a gunshot, and my body finally obeyed. I bolted, crashing through the undergrowth, my boots pounding against the earth. Branches tore at my clothes, lashed against my face, but I didn't dare slow down. The noise of pursuit grew behind me, closer, heavier, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. The fear of seeing whatever it was driving me forward outweighed the terror of the unknown. I ran through the dark forest, practically blind, lighting my way with the faint beam of a flashlight that now felt utterly useless. My feet slipped on the wet ground, branches lashed at my face and snagged my clothes. But I didn't stop. My heart pounded in my chest, My breath came in ragged gasps, and fear, thick as fog, filled my lungs. Behind me, the sounds of rustling and snapping branches echoed, but I didn't dare look back. Suddenly, through the tangle of trees ahead, I caught sight of a dim light. I skidded to a halt, straining to make sense of it. It turned out to be a small cabin hidden among the trees. Its walls were wooden and weathered, darkened with age, and its windows were boarded up. Only a thin sliver of light escaped through a gap in the boards, like someone had recently left a lamp burning inside. I crept toward the cabin, trying to keep quiet, and froze in front of the door. It was slightly ajar, creaking softly on rusty hinges. The darkness inside was impenetrable, but I took the risk and stepped in, gripping my shotgun tightly. The air inside smelled of wood resin and something old, almost rotten. In the dim light, I immediately noticed the room was filled with carved figurines. They were everywhere, on shelves, on the table, even on the floor. But these weren't charming little woodland creatures. Each figure was grotesque. Werewolves with twisted, predatory faces, wolves with needle-sharp teeth, and half-decayed creatures with long, clawed fingers. Each carving was so detailed it seemed alive. Their poses conveyed movement. One appeared ready to pounce. Another had its mouth wide open as if mid-roar, and a third crouched, head tilted as though it were watching me. "Who could have made these?" I whispered, feeling a chill crawl down my spine. I continued to explore the cabin. On one wall hung old photographs. At first they seemed ordinary, images of a forest, a clearing, trails. But as I looked closer, I noticed strange shadows in some of them. They looked exactly like the silhouettes I'd seen near the well. These shadows lurked behind trees as if watching the photographer. On the table lay several boxes of ammunition, a hunting rifle, and a few supplies. Canned food, a flask, a first aid kit. Someone had clearly been here recently. Whoever left these things must have known about the creatures that roamed this forest. I turned back to the figurines on the shelf, feeling fear rise in my chest again. "Could it be them?" I muttered. The figurines now seemed like evidence that these monsters were real. At that moment I heard a noise. The door creaked softly as if someone had pushed it from outside. I quickly switched off my flashlight and hid behind an old cabinet, holding my breath. The footsteps were heavy, uneven. Someone was approaching, breathing laboriously. My heart raced wildly. The door opened slowly, and a figure stepped inside. I recognized him immediately. It was Will. But he looked terrible. His face was pale, his shirt torn, and one hand gripped a hunting rifle while the other was smeared with blood. Drops of it fell to the floor, leaving dark stains. He limped as he moved, his breath ragged. I cautiously stepped out from my hiding spot. Will noticed the movement and quickly raised his rifle, aiming it at me. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice hoarse but menacing. "It's me," I said quickly, raising my hands. "Will, it's me." He recognized me, but his expression stayed wary. "What are you doing here?" he asked, lowering the gun slightly but keeping his finger on the trigger. I approached him carefully. "You're hurt. Let me help you." Will hesitated for a moment before nodding and gesturing toward the first aid kit on the table. I opened it, pulled out bandages and antiseptic, and examined his wound. His shoulder had a deep, jagged gash, as if he'd been bitten by a large animal. The edges of the wound looked terrible, and blood still oozed from it. "Is this a bite?" I asked, but Will didn't answer. He only groaned as I started cleaning the wound. "What happened to you?" I asked again. He raised his head and cut me off. "Tell me how you ended up here." I quickly recounted everything, from how Mike and I entered the forest to how I got lost and stumbled upon the cabin. Will listened in silence, his face growing darker with every word. When I mentioned the shadows near the well and the figurines, his expression turned icy. "You shouldn't have come here," he said finally. "They're already close." I felt cold fear gripping me, cutting straight to the bone. Outside, the forest seemed to come alive. Shadows darted past the walls, and faint rustling and creaking noises filled the air. Will lifted his head, his gaze focused and almost feral. "It's too late," he said, staring at the door. His face remained calm, but I saw his fingers tighten around the shotgun. "Grab a weapon," he nodded toward a cabinet. "There are silver rounds in there. Only those will work. Regular ones are useless." "Silver?" I repeated, not immediately processing what he meant. But I stumbled to my feet, opened the cabinet and found another shotgun. It looked old but well-maintained. Beside it was a box of bullets, each one gleaming faintly with a metallic sheen. My hands trembled as I loaded the weapon. Will had positioned himself in the far corner of the room, leaning against the wall. Despite his obvious discomfort from the wound, he looked completely in control. His shotgun was ready and his eyes were locked on the door. The windows were boarded up, leaving the door as the only point of entry, and it seemed like he had left it slightly open on purpose. He wanted them to come. "Hide," he ordered in a low voice, his gaze never leaving the door. I crouched behind the cabinet, gripping the shotgun so tightly my palms were slick with sweat. The silence in the room was suffocating. Only the steady rhythm of raindrops tapping against the roof added to the tense atmosphere, like a sinister metronome. And then the door began to open, slowly. The screech of its rusty hinges tore through the silence like a scream, making me flinch. The beam of the flashlight left on in the center of the room illuminated a massive, dark, hairy hand emerging from the shadows. It was monstrous, inhuman. Long claws, glinting faintly in the dim light, scraped against the wooden door, producing a low, grating sound. My heart pounded in my chest, so loud it drowned out everything else. It felt as though the world had stopped. The hand gripped the door, and the creature slowly pushed it open. When the door swung fully inward, I saw it. It was a horrifying hybrid of beast and man. Its body was covered in thick, dark fur, and its elongated snout bristled with sharp teeth. Glowing yellow eyes burned with an unnatural intensity. The creature stood tall and powerfully built, its muscular limbs ending in razor-sharp claws. It leaned slightly forward, sniffing the air, its pointed ears twitching as it listened. I was frozen in terror. The creature was a living nightmare, like one of the carved figures in this house brought to life. Only this wasn't wood. It was flesh and blood. It was as if the nightmare had stepped into the real world. The beast let out a low, guttural growl when it spotted Will in the corner. Before I could react, it lunged at him with terrifying speed. "Shoot!" Will barked, but the creature was already upon him. He fired first. The gunshot roared in the confined space, and the silver bullet struck the creature's shoulder, causing it to stagger back. The sound jolted me into action, and I fired my own weapon. The silver round struck the beast's side, and it let out a deafening roar, the kind that rattled the walls and chilled the soul. Despite its injuries, the creature kept moving, its massive claws swinging wildly. One strike shattered a small table by the wall, another tore through the floorboards. Will, unfazed by his wound, reloaded his shotgun with practiced speed and fired again, this time aiming for the beast's head. The shot connected, forcing the creature to its knees, but it still wasn't finished. Gritting my teeth, I raised my shotgun, took a deep breath, and aimed for its chest. The next shot struck true, piercing its heart. The beast convulsed violently, then collapsed onto the floor with a heavy thud, motionless. The room was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the sickly stench of decay emanating from the beast's corpse. My hands were trembling uncontrollably as I tried to steady myself, but the fear refused to let go. From outside, new sounds reached my ears. The forest was stirring again. It was subtle at first, faint movements among the trees, but soon it became unmistakable. The quiet shuffle of many feet drawing closer to the cabin. "They're coming," Will said, his voice hoarse and strained, yet carrying an unyielding determination. He reloaded his shotgun, his movements precise despite his injuries. "Get ready. We're not done yet." We both stood in the room, breathing heavily, staring at the fallen creature sprawled across the floor. Its body still twitched in the throes of death, and a thick, black, oily liquid seeped slowly from the wound in its chest. I tried to steady my nerves, but the growing noise outside made me grip the shotgun tighter. "They're coming," Will whispered, wincing slightly as the pain in his wounded shoulder flared. His eyes remained fixed on the door. The sounds of rustling, snapping branches, and footsteps grew louder. These creatures weren't trying to hide. They wanted us to hear them. It felt like a game to them, a cruel, drawn-out torment meant to stir fear, and it was working. Suddenly, a heavy blow struck one of the walls, followed by another. It sounded as though something massive was trying to break through the house from the opposite side. The boards covering the windows creaked under pressure, sharp claws scraping across the wood. Then came a low, guttural growl, a sound so deep I felt it reverberate in my chest. "Get ready," Will said, his voice calm but firm. He leaned against the wall, shotgun at the ready. His eyes were cold, alert. Those of a man who had fought battles like this before and knew what was coming. I crouched behind the cabinet, holding the shotgun in front of me. My heart raced, my hands trembled, but I knew there was no room for error now. The door suddenly flew open with a violent crash. Standing in the doorway was another creature. It was shorter than the first, but broader, with a wide chest and elongated front limbs that looked designed for tearing flesh. Its yellow eyes glowed fiercely, and saliva dripped from its snarling mouth, lined with rows of jagged teeth. It paused, sniffing the air, before locking its gaze on us. I fired first. The silver round struck its side, but instead of falling, the beast roared and lunged forward, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Will fired next, aiming for its head. The shot caused it to hesitate, but only for a moment, before it charged again. "Aim for the heart!" Will shouted. I scrambled to reload, my fingers fumbling as the creature closed in. It was just a few steps away when I raised the shotgun, took a shaky breath, and fired. The bullet struck its chest, and the creature let out a deafening roar that shook the room. It collapsed to the ground, its claws tearing into the wooden floor in a final spasm before it went still. Before we could catch our breath, a new sound came from the opposite side of the house. Another creature was attempting to break through a window, which groaned under its weight. Each blow weakened the boards more. I turned just in time to see it. Tall, with long, spindly limbs that resembled spider legs. Its face was gaunt, almost human, but horribly deformed. Its eyes glinted with malice, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque, silent grin. "Get down!" Will shouted. I hit the floor just as his shot rang out. The bullet struck one of the creature's limbs, knocking it back momentarily. The window gave way, and the beast burst into the room with a piercing roar. Its movements were jerky, unnatural but disturbingly fast. It grabbed at the furniture, toppling a table as it moved toward Will. Without thinking, I fired into its back. The creature halted and slowly turned to face me. Its eyes were filled with pure, seething hatred. "Now!" Will yelled. I fired again, aiming for its chest, but missed. The beast leaped toward me, claws extended. Before it could strike, Will fired with deadly precision, hitting it squarely in the heart. The creature let out a guttural scream before collapsing onto the floor. It convulsed violently for a moment, then fell silent. We sat in the heavy silence that followed, surrounded by the acrid stench of gunpowder and the sickly odor of decay. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure the entire forest could hear it. Will was breathing hard, his face pale, but his grip on the shotgun never faltered. After the final shot, Will set his shotgun aside and exhaled heavily. His wound was still bleeding, but he seemed to pay it no mind. Reaching for the first aid kit, he began fashioning a crude splint for his arm using whatever he could find nearby. I stepped closer to help, and this time, he didn't push me away. Together, we bandaged his shoulder and secured his injured arm. "This won't hold for long," he muttered in a raspy voice, testing the tension of the bandages. Then he made his way to the cabinet in the corner of the room. His movements were slow and labored, but his eyes stayed sharp and resolute. Opening the cabinet door, he pulled out a heavy revolver and a box of ammunition. I helped him load it, and as the last silver bullet clicked into place, he sealed at me. "All right," he said. "You're coming with me." I froze, staring at him in disbelief. "What? What are you talking about? What is this all about?" I asked, my voice rising with a fresh wave of panic. He sighed and leaned against the cabinet, casting a glance at the lifeless creatures sprawled across the floor. Their twisted claws, grotesque faces, everything about them was too real to dismiss as a nightmare. "I'll explain on the way. It's important. You can refuse, but if you do, I'll go alone. Your choice." I hesitated, looking at Will. His face, worn and tired but determined, was half lit by the flickering light of the lantern. My eyes drifted back to the bodies on the floor, the viscous black fluid pooling beneath them. I swallowed hard and nodded. "I'll go. I can't let you do this alone." He nodded back, a faint flicker of approval in his otherwise stony expression. Without another word, he moved to the door, and I followed. We stepped into the forest, now cloaked in pitch-black darkness. The oppressive silence returned, broken only by the crunch of our boots on the damp ground. Yet Will moved with certainty, as if he knew every path by heart. "What does all this mean?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. "These creatures, the well, you knew about them this whole time?" "Yes," he replied curtly. He remained quiet for a while longer, but then, as if compelled, he began to speak. "There's a legend," he started. "An old one, older than these woods. It says that long ago, when my ancestors first settled here, they found something at the heart of the forest. Something they couldn't explain. A chasm, a black scar in the earth. They said it wasn't just a hole, it was a door. A door to something that shouldn't exist." He paused, catching his breath before continuing. "My ancestors called it the breath of darkness. They believed that inside it lay an evil older than the world itself, banished by gods, spirits, whatever you want to believe. But it wasn't gone, not entirely. It sleeps there, deep down, waiting, and sometimes it stirs. When it does, the creatures come. Monsters, not beasts, not humans, something else entirely. They come into our world to kill, destroy, and feed the power of whatever's slumbering in that pit." He glanced at me, gauging my reaction, as though checking whether I could handle what he was saying. The legend says that one of my ancestors, a tribal leader, made a pact with the spirits to protect this world. They were shown how to seal the chasm. They carved totems from sacred wood and placed them around it as guardians. They painted symbols on trees and stones to protect the land. But it wasn't enough to stop the evil completely. The creatures still come. Sometimes rarely, sometimes more often. His gaze dropped for a moment, his voice growing heavier. Since then, the tribe swore to guard the chasm. It became their duty, passed down through generations. They fought, killed the creatures, maintained the seals. But like most things, the tribe faded away. People left, forgot. Only a few of us remain, those who remember. My father taught me. His father taught him. We don't know what these creatures are or where they come from. We just kill them because that's the only way to keep them at bay. I opened my mouth to ask something, but he raised a hand to stop me. I'm the last of my bloodline who still keeps this duty. I don't know why this is happening or why the evil chose this forest. But I do know this. If it's left unchecked, if these creatures are allowed to roam free, they'll destroy everything. And maybe they'll release whatever sleeps down there. He turned to face me fully, his eyes cold and unwavering. I can't explain more than that. This is just what I do. I watch the well. I patrol the forest. When they come, I put them down. And I'll keep doing it for as long as I can. You wanted to know? Now you do. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. His words echoed in my mind as we continued through the dark forest. The weight of them pressed down on me like the thick shadows surrounding us. Whatever I had stumbled into, it was far bigger than I could have imagined. With every step deeper into the dense forest, I felt as though I was trapped in some sick, twisted nightmare. The creatures I had seen, their claws, the guttural growls, the way they moved as if shadows themselves came alive around their bodies, none of it seemed real. But I knew it was. The ache in my muscles, the acrid tang of gunpowder in the air, the cold weight of the rifle in my hands, it was all painfully real. Will and I moved in silence, each sound around us making me flinch. The forest seemed even darker than before, as if the very air had thickened, becoming almost tangible. When the familiar totems appeared in the distance, I realized we were back at the cemetery. Will stopped abruptly, scanning the shadows with tense, watchful eyes. "Too quiet," he muttered under his breath. I glanced at the towering totems, at the strange symbols carved into the trees, and a chill ran down my spine. We stepped into the clearing, and my gaze fell on the well. This time, the heavy stone slab covering it had been shifted even further, leaving a gaping crack that exuded a cold, fetid air. "We need to seal it," Will said softly, as though afraid to disturb whatever might be lurking inside. He scanned the area one more time before nodding toward the well. "Come on. Together we can move it." Reluctantly, I approached the well, a gnawing fear growing inside me. The stone slab was massive, cracked, and covered in moss, but it felt impossibly heavy. I pressed my shoulder against it and started to push. It barely budged an inch. Will joined me on the other side, murmuring something under his breath in a low, rhythmic chant. The words were foreign, ancient, carrying an almost hypnotic cadence. I couldn't understand them, but they felt tied to this place, steeped in its ominous history. The slab scraped against the stone rim as it slowly shifted. Sweat dripped from my forehead, but I pushed with everything I had. Will wasn't in much better shape, though his chanting never faltered. Then we heard it. a sound. At first it was faint, like a whisper of wind through the trees. But it grew louder, a snapping of branches, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. We froze, weapons in hand, and whipped around to face the forest. Shadows darted between the trees, too quick to make out. The oppressive feeling of being watched pressed down on us like a physical weight. "They're here," Will murmured, raising his rifle. And then it came. A deafening roar shattered the silence as something massive burst from the trees. It was larger than any of the creatures we had seen before. Its towering frame was grotesque, with elongated limbs and an even more distorted, menacing form. But what froze me in place was the realization. It was female. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, but the face... it was a horrifying blend of human and beast. Yellow eyes burned with hatred, and its snarling mouth revealed jagged wolf-like teeth. It charged at us with terrifying speed. I fired first, the shot striking its shoulder, but it only enraged the creature. It let out a furious bellow and swiped at me with a clawed hand, sending me flying. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the rifle from my grasp. For a moment everything spun, my vision swimming. Will's gun roared to life. He fired shot after shot, each one precise. But they only seemed to slow the creature down. It turned on him, its claws slashing through the air as it advanced. I thought it was over. The monster's roar tore through the forest, a sound so primal and guttural it felt like it would rip the world apart. But then, more gunfire erupted, rapid and unrelenting. I turned my head to see Tom, Mike, and Carol emerging from the trees, rifles blazing. They poured bullet after bullet into the beast. The rounds didn't kill it, but they forced it to retreat. It screeched in fury, its movements becoming erratic and disoriented as the onslaught continued. The creature seemed to vanish into the darkness, but then, with terrifying speed, it leapt from the shadows, heading straight for Will. Its elongated, clawed arms grabbed him, and before any of us could react, it hurtled toward the well, dragging him along. I shouted, running after them, but the thing had already plunged into the black abyss, taking Will with it. At the last second, he managed to grab the edge of the well. I reached him just in time to see his white-knuckled hands clinging desperately to the stone, his legs dangling in the void. But it wasn't just darkness down there. Out of the depths, arms emerged, long, inhuman, coated in something slick and glistening. There were so many of them, all reaching, grasping. They coiled around Will's legs, pulling him downward. I could see him struggling, fighting with every ounce of strength he had left. But the hands were relentless. "Hold on!" I yelled, grabbing his arm. Bracing my feet against the edge of the well, I pulled with all my might. But those hands, they weren't just pulling him. They were pulling me too, dragging both of us toward that horrifying chasm. The others rushed to my side. Together we grabbed Will and pulled, straining against the impossible force. Yet it felt like a battle we couldn't win. Will's face had gone pale, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. But then his expression shifted. He looked at me, and there was something strange in his eyes, an eerie calm, a resignation. "Let go," he rasped, his voice hoarse but steady. "It's already taken me." "No," I shouted, "we'll get you out of there." But he shook his head slowly, a faint, almost wistful smile on his lips. "Listen to me," he said. "Promise me you'll watch over this place. You've seen it now. You know." I nodded, even though my chest felt like it was being crushed. I didn't want to let him go. "Behind the house," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "There's a pit. Throw the bodies in there. Burn them. Destroy them." "Don't say that," I screamed, tears blurring my vision. My hands were slipping. his wrist slick with sweat and blood. The hands from the abyss pulled harder, and I felt him being wrenched away. "You have to," he said, his voice low and final. And then, without warning, he let go. His hand slipped from mine, and I didn't even have time to react. Will fell into the black void, the arms from the abyss closing around him like a grotesque cocoon, dragging him into the depths. The last thing I saw was his face, vanishing into the darkness. The man who had dedicated his life to protecting us from these horrors was gone, right before my eyes. I knelt at the edge of the well, stunned, unable to tear my gaze from the darkness below. It seemed alive, whispering to me, pulling at me. Inside, I felt a cold, gnawing fear, an unbearable guilt, and a strange, horrifying realization. This burden was mine now. I was here. I had seen. I knew. Tom's hand rested on my shoulder, jolting me from my stupor. "We have to move," he said quietly but firmly. I stood, swaying slightly, as if the ground itself had shifted. Looking at the others, I nodded. "We need to seal the well," I whispered. Together, we all pushed against the stone slab. It was monstrously heavy, but we strained against it with everything we had. The forest was eerily silent, save for the rasp of stone grinding against stone and our labored breathing. Inch by inch, we shifted it into place until, with a final hollow thud, it covered the well, sealing away the horrors below. I stared at the slab, feeling nothing but emptiness inside. The forest around us was silent again, a tense, watchful quiet as though it, too, recognized the battle was over. But the pain of losing Will, of what I had just witnessed, was far too real. "He didn't die for nothing," Tom said softly, as if he could sense my thoughts. But his words brought no comfort. We walked back through the forest in complete silence. No one said a word until I finally broke it. My voice shook, but I forced myself to speak. "Will, he told me about this place, about who he was, and what those things are." I paused, glancing at the others. "His family, his ancestors, they've been guarding this forest for generations. It's their duty. He was the last of his line." Tom, Mike, and Carol stopped in their tracks, staring at me as though I'd just told them the world was ending. "These creatures, these things," I continued. "They come from that well, from the abyss. This place, it's supposed to stay sealed. But if no one watches over it, if someone opens it completely..." I trailed off, unable to finish. "Jesus Christ," Mike muttered, his pale face turning even whiter as he looked from me to Tom. "And you knew this the whole time?" Carol finally asked. There was no accusation in her voice, just shock. "No," I said quickly. "I only found out from Will. And now we have to take over his job." They were silent, their faces grim. No one argued. As we walked back toward the house, I told them everything I knew. Every word felt heavier than the last, and with each step, the forest around us seemed to change. More alien, more hostile. When we reached the house, the bodies of the creatures we'd killed lay where we'd left them. Even in the dim light, they were horrifying. Twisted figures, claws, teeth, a grotesque blend of beast and something not entirely of this world. Mike let out a heavy sigh. Carol turned away, and Tom clenched his jaw so hard I could hear his teeth grind. "No one can know about this place," I said firmly, looking at each of them in turn. "We can't risk someone trying to use it for something worse." Tom was the first to nod, his expression resolute. "We won't tell anyone," he said. "This stays with us." "Promise," Carol added, though her voice trembled. Mike said nothing, but he gave a curt nod. We began searching the area behind the house and eventually found a hatch, hidden beneath a thick layer of moss and branches. Tom pried it open with difficulty. The cover was heavy, and the hinges were rusted. When we finally managed to lift it, all of us froze. The hatch led to a deep pit that stretched far into the ground. At the bottom, faintly illuminated, were piles of old bones. They lay in a chaotic heap, tangled like a spider's web. It was immediately clear they belonged to the same kind of creatures we had just fought. There were so many of them, a mass grave. It was proof of Will's ancestors' work, of the generations who had carried this burden before us. We began tossing the bodies of the creatures into the pit. Each one hit the bottom with a sickening thud, the sound echoing up like a reminder of the weight of this place. With every body we threw, I felt the heaviness of the day pressing harder on my chest. As I stared into the pit, at the bones and the dark legacy of Will's family, his final words echoed in my mind. His face, that look in his eyes just before he let go, haunted me. When we finished, I lingered at the edge of the pit, staring down. Everything inside me felt hollow. This place, these events, they had changed me. I couldn't walk away from this. "This is my job now," I murmured to myself, but Tom overheard. "What did you say?" he asked. I looked up at them. They stood there, tired and worn, waiting for my answer. "I'm staying here," I said firmly. "I'll look after this place. Someone has to." No one argued. Tom gave me a short nod, his expression approving. Mike looked at me with something close to relief, and Carol, though exhausted, nodded as well. We closed the hatch, covering it carefully with branches and dirt to keep it hidden. Then we headed back to the house, each of us lost in our thoughts. But I knew from this day forward, I was no longer the same person who had arrived in this town just weeks ago. Now, I was the keeper.